Former inmates, what's the saddest thing you've seen in prison? Cellmate in juvenile detention. I ended up in a juvenile detention center as a child for accidentally starting a forest fire. A campfire got out of control. My cellmate was just a few years younger than me. He was a very kind and calm guy, and we got along well. We even became friends during my time there. Since I was still a kid, I didn't ask about the different uniforms or why people were there. On the day I was released, I found out that my cellmate had been imprisoned for murder. It turned out his stepfather had physically abused him, so he killed him. I never learned all the details, but talking to him, he seemed like a good person at heart. He had things going for him and genuinely cared about certain people and interests. The guards obviously knew what he had done, yet they treated him kindly, better than some other prisoners. I always wondered what happened to him afterward. 57-year-old man. I saw a 57-year-old man sentenced to life crawling on the floor under the influence of synthetic psychoactive cannabinoids. He was screaming because he claimed to see his dead mother towering over him, looking at him with disgust. Not exactly pleasant, especially if you're stuck in the same cell with someone like that. Suicide of a young man. Another incident involved a 22-year-old who flooded his cell, set it on fire, and committed suicide just 2 months before his release. There was also another case where a guy cut himself. Well, let's just say he mutilated himself severely due to drugs making him believe that an erection was evil. Long story short, stay away from spice. 11-year-old boy. When I was 15 or 16, I served time in juvenile detention. Most of us were older teens, but one day an 11-year-old boy arrived. He had been locked up for throwing stones at his teacher's house. At our facility, most of the guards were civilian workers since we were minors. One guard, named Travis, started acting strangely around this kid. Initially, the boy acted like any happy 11-year-old, but Travis became overly affectionate during meals, rubbing against him. We could all see it through the bars. We weren't allowed out of our cells, but everyone noticed how Travis would touch the boy's back and legs. After a few days, the boy's attitude toward Travis changed dramatically. We all knew Travis was molesting him, even though we couldn't prove it. Death in a shared cell. I knew someone who had never gotten into trouble before. He worked in the automotive industry in Michigan and lost his job. When he fell behind on child support payments, he ended up in jail. On his first night, there was a conflict between his 2 cellmates over missing cookies. Eventually, they stopped arguing and went to sleep. Later, my acquaintance woke up to the sound of one cellmate brutally beating the other with some kind of rod or stick. The entire cell was covered in blood. It turned out the accused man hadn't stolen anything. I'll never forget the look of fear on my friend's face when he recounted the event. First night in jail. At 19, I spent a week in a county jail in rural Kansas on charges of drug possession. I was terrified. The room had 4 communal picnic tables and 2 rooms on either side with around 6 beds each. One room was full while the other held only 1 man. Not knowing any better, I approached the empty beds until someone grabbed me by the shoulder and gave me a stern glare without saying a word. Then I noticed others sitting in corners on their mattresses, so I did the same. I soon learned the lone man was serving time for a crime against a child. That night, I heard screams louder than anything I'd ever experienced. There were cries and pleas. I just buried my head in the wall, wondering how I ended up here. Fortunately, I was released on bail the next day. Library incident. One day, I was reading legal literature in the library when a new guy came in and sat down to read too. A buddy of mine, someone I'd known for over a year, a laid-back guy incarcerated for cocaine trafficking, stood up, walked over, and knocked the newcomer unconscious. Blood splattered everywhere. The poor guy lay on the ground as my friend kept punching him, literally smashing his face inward. I stepped aside to avoid getting involved. Guards eventually arrived, dragged the lifeless body away, and cuffed my friend. Later, I asked my friend why he did it, and all he said was, "I just felt like hitting someone." Ever since then, I've struggled with trust issues, especially after witnessing the brutal killing of an 18-year-old right before my eyes. Israel, living on the streets. In my neighborhood lived a 17-year-old named Israel. His grandmother kicked him out for substance abuse, forcing him to live on the streets. A couple of months later, he was arrested for stealing packages. Despite being young and generally decent, he enjoyed every minute of his 30-day sentence because it meant food and shelter. By the end of those 30 days, he didn't want to leave. He planned to commit another offense to return. I tried convincing him otherwise, that he should reconcile with his grandmother, quit drugs, and work toward independence. He listened but probably didn't take my advice. I hope he didn't end up back in jail. Brother's gold teeth. My brother had 3 gold teeth when he entered prison. Within the first few months, they were ripped out. He claimed it happened during a fight, but a guard later explained that based on the damage to his gums, it was likely forced extraction. Death of a kind man. I knew a very kind man who served time for violating parole after stealing something. He was homeless, somewhat slow-witted, and suffered from schizophrenia or something similar. Yet, he was a genuinely nice person. For some reason, he was sent to solitary confinement where guards beat him to death. The officers responsible are now in prison themselves. It's hard to believe such a thing happened to him. Attempted suicide. Working in the cafeteria allowed me to leave my cell daily. One day, a guard instructed me to check the cells on the first floor. In one, I found a man standing shirtless in the middle of the room, crying. He had slashed his wrists. I called for help and he survived initially, but soon afterward he hanged himself. Carlos and the new roommate. I shared a cell with a man we'll call Carlos. A new roommate tried to assault Carlos sexually. With no other choice, Carlos stabbed him with a shank, adding 5 years to his sentence. Though Carlos reported the incident to the guards and board, claiming self-defense, I don't know how it turned out except that his sentence was extended. Recently, I confirmed Carlos was released in 2017 as scheduled. The new roommate had a bad reputation documented in several prosecutorial reports, which led to a review of his case. Family tragedy. A weightlifting partner learned that his father had murdered his wife, the man's mother, and their child before taking his own life. He retreated to his cell for a while but emerged 40 minutes later calling for help. With slashed wrists and a badly cut neck, he barely made it out of the cell before collapsing unconscious. This was almost as shocking as when my best friend's brother shot himself in the head in an adjacent room. Elderly gentleman. An elderly gentleman joined our facility. He constantly cried about his dogs, lamenting how much he missed them and how he'd never be able to pet them again. During one of his emotional breakdowns, his cellmate grew tired of the noise and broke the man's arms, then cut off his fingers so he could never stroke his pets again. Forced confession. Another inmate continuously cried without explanation until it became clear that an officer had coerced him into confessing to murder. Otherwise, the officer threatened to rape his sister in front of him. The man confessed and received a life sentence. We live in a highly conservative country. COVID-19 era in juvenile detention. During the pandemic, I was detained in a juvenile facility. The only person I could talk to was a 13-year-old girl since we arrived together. Social distancing rules were strictly enforced throughout our stay. Her story was heartbreaking. She chose to take the blame for her drug-addicted mother's actions to keep her out of prison. Her body bore countless scars and bruises. Prison visits. My ex-boyfriend spent nearly 3 years in prison. Every Saturday, I visited him in the visiting room, a large space filled with small tables and chairs. One woman frequently visited her husband, sometimes sitting on his lap and grinding against him while her 2 young children watched nearby. The guards ignored this because the man was a powerful drug dealer. Watching these interactions left me feeling disturbed, especially for the kids. My ex scolded me for showing disapproval, fearing retaliation from the inmate. Thanks for watching. In the comments below the video, former inmates write what's the saddest thing you've seen in prison, and don't forget to check out our other videos.